in Helena, Montana, where she has practiced since 2021. She is originally from South Carolina and received her law degree at the University of Montana Law School. For the 15 years prior to 2021, she worked on water law and policy in Montana. Barbara developed and advanced strategies for protecting and restoring the Clark Fork River watershed, for which we are all thankful. Thanks, Barbara. She also worked as an attorney for the Montana Department of Natural Resources and Conservation for 5 years. She is part of the legal team for the 16 young plaintiffs in the landmark climate change trial. And Barbara worked closely with the youth and will share her insights, experiences, and the big takeaways on the trial. With her expertise, you will build a better appreciation and understanding of this historic trial and the court's decision to uphold their case. Barbara, thank you so much for coming today and be part of our Laudato Si weekend. So give Barbara a warm welcome.
Thank you so much, Phyllis. Good morning.
Good morning.
Everyone. Thank you so much for coming and for having me here today. I was telling Sandy and Phyllis, this is one of the more unique speaking opportunities I've had so far, so I really appreciate getting to talk with you all on a Sunday morning. So as Phyllis said, I'd love to just give you all kind of a little bit of an overview of the Held v. Montana case, and then the trial that happened almost a year ago now, last June. And then I'd love to have an opportunity, or leave an opportunity for you all for a discussion and conversation. I think that's really valuable, and I'd love to learn from you all on what you found inspiring from the case itself, and then how you see this maybe kind of reverberating throughout Montana in your own lives. So I'll just get started now. And so I should say, I was one of several people on the legal team who kind of made this case kind of come to fruition. And our Children's Trust is an organization based in Eugene, Oregon, and they bring these cases across the country and globally. And they've spearheaded this work, and so I was fortunate to find myself in the right place at the right time to be able to join the legal team and then join the trial team. So it was really a great opportunity. So I just want to kind of lay the foundation a little bit for the case itself. And so, in Montana, we have, as many of you have probably heard, we have a very strong constitution on environmental protection. In fact, it's one of the strongest constitutions in the country. There are only about a handful of other states who have what's kind of generally called in environmental rights, environmental amendments to the Constitution. And so in Article 2, Section 3 of the Montana Constitution, every one of us has an inalienable right to a clean and healthful environment. Those rights also extend to minors under Section 15 of that same article. And then under Section 17, we all have what's called kind of our fundamental due process rights, which are to life, liberty, property, the pursuit of happiness. Those rights were all implicated in this case, though we focused on the right to a clean and healthful environment. And paired with that right is a corresponding obligation under Article 9, Section 1 of Montana's Constitution, which says that the state and each person shall maintain and improve a clean and healthful environment for present and future generations. So those constitutional provisions really kind of were the foundation for our case. And then we have the young people who bravely agreed to join this case or volunteered in most cases, or in all cases, of course. They weren't compelled to do so. I often get questions about, how did you find these young people? And in many cases, they found us. They had heard and been inspired by the Juliana case at the federal level and the work that our Children's Trust had been doing. Many of these students were really active in their green groups in high school or in middle school, they'd done a lot of kind of service work around climate and the environment, and really were very just kind of, I'd say overachievers in the really trying to kind of make change at their even at their young ages. So we had Plano 16 young people from across the state. Most were, as our population is, most were focused kind of in the western half of the state. The lead plaintiff, Ricky Held, was the only one at the time of the case filing in March of 2020 that was was 18. And so she agreed to have her name as the kind of the name of the case. And Ricky Held is from Broadus, Montana, and she, her family ranches on the Powder River there. And so she was the lead plaintiff. At the time of case filing in March of 2020, the ages were between around 2 years old to 18 years old. And so there's quite a range in ages. The other piece is that, a lot of folks asked, why Montana? And, for better or for worse, we kind of have a perfect storm here in Montana. We have a very strong constitution. We also have a lot of extractive industries here in Montana. And we have coal mining, refineries, you name it. As was borne out in the trial, Montana is, even though we're a small state in population, we are responsible for a significant contribution to greenhouse gas emissions in the state. And in fact, the emissions in Montana are on par with other countries that are, exponentially larger in population to Montana, like Pakistan, Argentina, the Netherlands. So it was, kind of just a great example of a place where we could have a big impact with this type of litigation. The defendants were, the state of Montana, so we named the governor, and then as well as several of the state agencies that are in charge of implementing the environmental laws in Montana. The complaint was filed again in March of 2020. There were other big things happening right around that time, as you all may recall. So it was I wasn't involved at this time, but the story I heard from the lead attorney, Nate Bellinger, who's based in Oregon, they had planned this kind of more of a ceremonial filing, and so he was going to fly to Montana, and several of the youth were going to join him at the courthouse. And then COVID happened, and so he said, okay, well, I'm going to drive to Montana. And then a snowstorm happened, and then everything shut down. So he turned around, and then they filed electronically, which is kind of boring, but also necessary at that time. So the complaint was, it's about a 103-page complaint. The main claims that we brought were challenging two specific statutory provisions. One was the State Energy Policy Act, which basically is kind of the policy set forth by the legislature to, the reason we challenged it was because it was really kind of focused on promoting the development of fossil fuel energy resources rather than kind of transitioning to renewables. That claim did not go to trial because the legislature cleverly repealed that law right before trial. So that kind of mooted out that claim for us. So the claim that survived and the fundamental claim statute that we challenged was the Montana Environmental Policy Act, or MEPA. And so that law basically requires the state agencies that anytime there's a project that requires state approval, that the state must conduct an environmental analysis. And so the law that we challenged said that the state, you can look at everything as far as impacts go, but you cannot look at the impact of a project on climate change. And so we called that the kind of MEPA climate change exception, and that's what we challenged in court. And so between this and this was a lot of work. Yeah. And so it took a little over 3 years to get to trial. Along the way, the state filed a lot of motions to try to get the case dismissed, get it resolved on what's called summary judgment, to really just prevent kind of the ability of the youth plaintiffs to tell their stories in court. And so we survived all of those challenges, and then there's the discovery process where we exchange documents. We has anyone ever conducted or have been deposed? Have you been in a deposition before? So lawyers, if maybe there are lawyers here or people who've been deposed themselves. Well, most of the plaintiffs were deposed by the state attorneys, and so imagine young people being questioned about does your family use plastic? Do you ever travel on airplanes? Kind of getting to the point is like you really aren't sincere in your challenge here, right? And so our plaintiffs did just an excellent job. So brave. No one wants to just sit through that. So we survived all of that, and then some last minute challenges to try to prevent the trial, and then we made it. So we got to trial, and it was originally scheduled for 10 days in June. So the way it worked is we kind of split up our time where the plaintiffs would have the first week or the first 5 days of trial days, and then the state would have the second week. We wrapped up our case in the afternoon of Friday of the first week, and then the state put on a pretty short case with calling three witnesses, and they were pretty much done in a day and a half. So we, so it was a quick defense. So just a few highlights from the trial, and the signifying the importance of just having these kids get to go to court and talk to a judge about their harms, and how it was so powerful. And those of you who were able to attend or watch any of it, just maybe kind of witness that, just how compelling the testimony was. And so the way it worked was we designed the kind of order of witnesses to kind of generally be like a plaintiff and an expert, plaintiff expert. It didn't always play out that way, but most of the time the plaintiffs, were up telling their stories, their real lived experiences with climate harms, and then we'd have an expert come in and kind of, back them up, validate what they've experienced through science and through, this is really what's happening, on the ground, and these plaintiffs' lived experiences are, they're real, and this is why it's happening or why they're experiencing these. So I think one thing that I loved was every day going into court, just people lined the sidewalk going into the courthouse, and I'm so proud of Helena for one, and Montana too, just of how much people showed up for these kids, and it was just so heartwarming. It just, trials aren't necessarily the most exciting thing sometimes, or a time to be joyous, but that's what I felt often, was just the support and the happiness and the joy coming from the community was just so, you could just feel it, and I was just so proud of you all and Helena. So our first, I just want to kind of run through a few of the witness testimony, a little bit of the witness testimony. And our very first witness was Maynann Ellingson, and she was the youngest delegate to the 1972 Montana Constitutional Convention. She testified, and she's actually my boss back in another life, so it was kind of fun. She testified to the intent of the framers of the Constitution really was to have the strongest environmental protections of any constitution, and that the point was to prevent any further degradation of Montana's environment. And so she was just it was a really cool way to start the trial, with just someone who was actually there writing the Constitution, and just could really speak to, this is what we meant what we said, and that was really, really cool. Ricky Held was the lead plaintiff, so she was kind of the one who, lead on the complaint, lead in the testimony, really brave. We spent a ton of time. So the home base for our operation was at I guess it's still the Doubletree Hotel in the Walkie Mall, and so we would, convene there with the plaintiffs and do prep, and so we were working throughout the weekend, of course, before trial, and then every night after trial day, and we would just be in rooms with the plaintiffs, really walking them through their testimony. we had a lot of visuals to go with it, like demonstrative exhibits to just kind of tell the story in pictures as the plaintiffs were testifying. And so we kind of run through all of that, and just, you know, a lot of late nights and a lot of kind of nerves that we'd have to help, you know, kind of calm and, you know, just try to make people as comfortable as possible, because what a big thing with cameras pointing at you, and then just the reality of being in a courtroom that's so, you know, a solemn place. And so Ricky led it off and did just a wonderful job of kind of, I don't know, Phyllis, you were there for that, but it was, mostly there were tears, you know, after every plaintiff testified. It was just really heartfelt and sincere. So another example is, so I'll go back. Ricky discussed like impacts to her ranch from heat, from the Powder River, you know, running dry, just a lot of kind of economic impacts to ranching and, you know, traditional Montana values. Sariel is a member of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribe. She discussed kind of the impact of climate change on her traditional cultural practices, and how she, for example, there are, you know, traditional stories that her tribe, the elders in her tribe tell, that creation stories that can only happen when there's snow on the ground. And so the impact of, you know, shorter winters, snow not being on the ground as frequently, it you know, it has a real impact on these cultural traditions. And Sariel spoke really beautifully to that, and it was really, it was a really cool part. We also had two plaintiffs who are members of the Crow tribe, and their dad testified on their behalf and just talked about kind of traditional ceremonies like Crow Fair that is often just now so hot, and the extreme heat there is really impacting kind of their cultural practices. Another plaintiff, Claire, she lives in Bozeman. She just had this remarkable story of basically fundraising for the solar array for her middle school. And she just, you know, didn't take no for an answer when she was initially told that, you know, it's too expensive or there's not enough space. And so she, even just as a middle schooler, was able to, you know, accomplish this feat. And she also had a really compelling story about, you know, being born with a physical disability and really needing the outdoors to kind of as her physical therapy, and her family didn't have medical insurance, and the way she was able to kind of move her body in a way that she needed to was to be outside. And she overcame that disability. She's a runner, she's a ski instructor, but she's really dependent on, you know, the outdoors in Montana, and being able to be out in the outdoors without smoke and heat, extreme heat, to really, you know, maximize her physical therapy. So she had an interesting story there. And, you know, I should say that the point of the plaintiff's testimony was, one, to tell their stories, and two, to draw a connection between the harms that are that climate change is causing, and their personal harms. And then our job as attorneys was to make that connection between the state of Montana's actions in permitting fossil fuel projects without analyzing climate change and those harms. And so in some cases, you've heard maybe the term standing, which is basically a legal term that says, you know, for a plaintiff to come into court and sue someone, you have to demonstrate that, one, you've been harmed, and two, you have to demonstrate that the person you're suing is at least a cause or contributor to your harm. And then three, you have to demonstrate that the remedy you seek will help even just a little bit alleviate your harm. And so we were, you know, through their testimony and the testimony of our expert witnesses, trying to connect those dots for the judge. This is Micah, and for those of you who were there, he was one of my favorite. He's pretty shy, and he's just so sincere. And he's the only one that got me choked up. I was very proud that I was mostly able to help people, you know, come to tears during this testimony, but then he actually got me. So he was very sweet and sincere. And so he's a runner, and he talked a lot about, and he's also an activist. So from an early age, he would stand on the corner in Missoula with signs, protesting, whether it's Northwestern Energy's, fossil fuel resources or, other kind of climate things in Montana. He and his mom would kind of do that on their own for a while until they would get, other people to join them. And he's also a runner, he has asthma, and he's a writer. And so one of the parts of his testimony was he read a poem that he had written when he was it was super smoky in Missoula. He was quarantined in his basement because the rest of his family had COVID, and he was just so low. And he wrote this sad poem about just how he can't go outside, it's smoky, he can't go be with his family because they have COVID, and he's just, why won't anyone do anything about this? And I think that was kind of the theme going forward, is that these youth are doing everything they can. Most of them, save one, could not vote whenever the case was filed, and they had no recourse other than to go to the court to enforce and to protect their rights. And so it was just, part of that was Micah's testimony, just really describing how he felt so hopeless, and he really needed someone to step up for him. And then Olivia, also from Missoula, I think she was one of the last, not the last, but one of the last plaintiffs to testify, and she's an artist, and testified to kind of her kind of anxiety and depression, and how she exemplifies that through her art. And so she was able to describe a couple of her art pieces during the trial, and just how those reflect kind of her lived experience and her feelings of kind of desperation, kind of paired with hope, which is a part of her theme. Then we had experts, and so the plaintiff, like I said, we kind of intermixed the experts with the plaintiffs, and which really helped just solidify their stories. So the first expert that testified after Ricky held was Dr. Steve Running. Many of you may have heard of him. He is a climate scientist, co-recipient of the Nobel Prize in 2007. He was able to lay out kind of just the very basics of climate change. It's happening, and here's why it's happening. And it was really, just a good foundation for the case. So we went in thinking we'd have to prove up the fact that climate change is real and that it's caused by humans, because the state would not admit to that in their kind of answer to our complaint, and that was part of their defense going into it. And so we said, okay, we'll start with the basics here, so just to get everyone on the same page. Dr. Running did a great job of setting that stage. And I'm not gonna go into details because we're kind of short on time. I'm happy to talk to you more about this. Basically kind of said where we were in terms of climate now, which is not in a good place. And then he said where we need to be is numeric. And so if we get, kind of reduce our concentration of greenhouse gas emissions to 350 parts per million of CO2, that's kind of the happy place that we want to be as a world. And so he kind of, set the stage where we know where we are, we know where we need to be. Dr. Kathy Whitlock followed Dr. Roning as, in the expert lineup, and she brought it home to Montana. And so she's a professor at MSU in Bozeman. She's done a lot of cool work in Yellowstone National Park, just a really amazing scientist. And so she has co-authored a number of climate change reports in Montana, the Montana Climate Change Action Plan, or the Climate Action Plan, the Climate Assessment, and then she partnered with a couple of physicians to do kind of the climate change and human health assessment, which really kind of tied it together to what we're seeing as in terms of impacts on humans and their environment. We had Dr. Dan Faegre, who is a glaciologist, who's retired now, but he worked in Glacier for a long, long time, and talked about just the what we're seeing with the glaciers receding in Glacier National Park. And we are fortunate to have a really amazing record, because the glaciers have been photographed over decades, and over a century really. And so it's been really, that was a pretty compelling part of the testimony as well, because many of the plaintiffs testified to their love of Glacier National Park, and their sadness at knowing that the glaciers will likely not be around for their own children to see. And so that his testimony really, kind of validated those concerns. We also had a freshwater ecologist, Dr. Jack Stanford, and just made the connection with what we all see every summer with, our rivers getting hotter, running lower, often going dry, and just how that all kind of connects to the entire kind of ecosystem. And then I thought one of the most compelling parts for me was Dr. Lori Byron, who talked about the health impacts for young people especially. And, a lot of, what we tried to kind of emphasize is that young people just aren't little adults. They're developing at a intense rate. Their bodies are going through a lot of changes and are more impacted by climate events or, smoke and fire and heat than adults are, frankly. So she made a really compelling case about, why young people, why are they different? Why are they disproportionately harmed? And then we had Mr. Michael Derglo, who is with the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. He is there in their tribal preservation department, has worked a lot with young people on the reservation and putting together the reservations and the tribe's climate action plan. And so he spoke a lot to what Sarah Yell spoke about in terms of her experiences with her own family and culture, cultural practices. And he was able to just say, yeah, she's right. And here's some more information about, what we're doing as a tribe to try to mitigate these impacts and, really the experiences that we're feeling on the reservation. And then finally, a couple more. Another compelling expert was Ms. Ann Hedges, who she lives here in Helena. She works for the Montana Environmental Information Center. She was able to speak very authoritatively to the state's policy over time on how they've looked at climate change. This law that we challenged was enacted in 2011, and she was able to make the connection, before 2011, the state was looking at climate change and its, permitting of, coal mines and things like that. But, once that law came into place, they stopped doing that at all and just, kind of put their head in the sand. So she was able to, kind of speak to that, and really her point was that the state's never denied a permit for a fossil fuel project, and it was just very helpful in terms of kind of setting the stage for the policy concerns. And then the last two, or a couple of the last two expert witnesses spoke to Mr. Peter Erickson, he's with an organization called the Stockholm Institute. I think he's based in Seattle right now, but works in Switzerland and Sweden. And he spoke to kind of Montana's contribution to climate change. And he's a greenhouse gas accounting person. And so he can, he using kind of standard formulas and how across the world greenhouse gas contributions are calculated. He made the point that Montana's contribution is disproportionately large based on our population, and so because of the resources that we have here in Montana, especially the coal reserves, the coal that's already been extracted and transported and burned here, and the reserves we have, there's a significant amount of coal still in the ground. And I think the part of the point of this case is that we want to kind of take some action before those resources are further developed. And then finally, the other last one I wanted to kind of highlight is Dr. Mark Jacobson, who has done an analysis of all 50 states to determine how quickly we can do the transition from fossil fuel resources to renewable energy. And so he was able to paint that picture for the court that, we have the technology available now, as well as the wind and solar resources and the hydro resources to make this switch. And, what was pretty cool in the judge's order is that she made a finding that, the constraints to transitioning to renewable energy aren't technical, they are social and political. And I think that was really, a compelling finding for her to make, for Judge Seeley to make, and because it's true, is that we have the technology, and Dr. Jacobson really kind of brought us home there, and kind of gave us a good kind of lead out in our putting on our case that we have all these resources, the fossil resources that we've developed. We should be done with that now because we can go ahead and move on. So like I said, the point is kind of was to use the expert testimony to translate to real harms for the plaintiffs. And so through both kind of the interweaving of that testimony, we were able to kind of bring things together. These plaintiffs are experiencing respiratory harms from the increase in wildfire smoke, as well as other things that I learned so much just sitting through this trial. It was an amazing educational opportunity for me too, but one thing I learned was that even allergies are getting worse due to climate because of just increased pollen count, and there are a number of factors contributing to that, but that's another thing that's worsening kind of respiratory illness as well. And then again, impacts to recreation, river, fishing, being outside, heat impacts. There was a lot of really compelling testimony, and my own daughter plays soccer, and when she's playing, when it's 95 degrees and she's out running in the field, just red-faced, I just worry, and these plaintiffs testified really kind of, painted that picture of how hard it is when you kind of feel your cleats kind of melting in the turf, and it's just, it was really interesting. And then finally, Ricky and her ranching impact. And then we talked a lot about decreased snowpack and what that means for Georgie, who's a professional skier who grew up in Bozeman and can't train in Montana anymore because the winter there's not enough snow, and the summer is too hot, and so she and her race team choose to train elsewhere. And then Eva, I haven't spoken much about her at all today, but she was one of my favorites, and she lives in Livingston, and her family lived on the Shields River for a number of years, and the bridge, it was a huge Yellowstone flood event that happened a couple summers ago, which she kind of witnessed from Livingston, but before that, there were a couple really big flood events on the Shields River, which washed out the bridge going to her home. So, and then they put in a temporary bridge, and that washed out too. So her family had to move into town because they just couldn't kind of afford to keep commuting so far to get, to school and to work. And so she had a really interesting story about that. So like I said at the beginning of the trial talk, we had so much support in this community, and whenever we were finished putting on our case, it was just a celebration, and the community came out and rallied with the youth, and we had events in, I think that's Anchor Park by the public library, and it was just a really, I think they just felt so supported and so happy that they had gone through it and did a great job. They all showed up with a job to do and something they wanted to do, and our job was to help them do that. And I think they all kind of left feeling like they were able to accomplish that and felt proud and were able to tell their stories in the best way they could. So, and I think the judge agreed. So we got a really great order in August of last year from Judge Seeley, and we couldn't have been happier with her order. She really could tell that she listened. She, just some examples. I'm gonna take a glass of water. I'll let you read this while I have some water. I think, excuse me, I've just lost my voice. I think one of the findings that I was most excited about was her recognition that every ton of fossil fuel emissions matters, and it contributes to global warming and also to the harm to the plaintiffs. So that's exactly the take home we wanted her to have, because that's what's happening. So. Judge Seeley also found that there were harms occurring now in Montana, and that the state of Montana's decisions were contributing to those harms. And so that helped us make the connection to, the harms that these plaintiffs are experiencing, which were unrefuted. The state didn't really put on, I skipped that part because it wasn't very significant. The state put on a very small defense, basically, not really refuting the testimony of the plaintiffs or really even our experts, other than kind of the ability to transition to renewables and whether that was really real or true. They put on a couple of state agency leaders who basically said, the legislature sets the policy, we just do our jobs, and so we're not allowed to look at climate change. And, the judge, agreed, yeah, you're not allowed to because of that statute, and that statute it's unconstitutional because it contributes to these unexamined harms to these plaintiffs. And so the gist is Judge Seeley found the MEPA climate change exception unconstitutional and ordered the department to stop conducting analyses in compliance with that unconstitutional provision. And so she found that it violated the plaintiff's right to a clean and healthful environment. And the significance of that decision, some people can really look at it and say this was a very narrow decision, really focused on one piece of statute. The state likes to say this is a procedural statute. It's not going to change anything on the ground about how we permit because it doesn't compel us to make a decision one way or the other. If we examine a project and it says, our analysis says it'll contribute, X amount of tons of greenhouse gas emissions and warming, we still don't have the authority to deny a project based on that finding, but we disagree. And so we believe that the Judge Seeley's order and what we were able to prove was that these contributions to climate change result in unconstitutional harm, and when the state will, now that it's required to look at that harm, will be compelled to make a different decision. And so the way that kind of will play out is to be determined. We are up at the Montana Supreme Court right now. The state appealed Judge Seeley's decision, and the case is, it's all decided on briefs. And so right now, as of last week, the case is fully briefed, and while the Supreme Court doesn't, as a matter of course, set an oral argument, we're pretty certain they will in this case because it's so important to the public. So we anticipate an oral argument will be scheduled, hopefully in the next couple of months, and that we'll get a decision by, hopefully by the end of the summer and early fall. And so right now, even though it's been up on appeal, the state is still required to kind of follow Judge Seeley's order and analyze climate. And they've started to do so in some of their documents, in a very cursory way. But as far as implications go, I think there are three, right? I think one is that the state is already starting to, even dragging its feet, trying to start looking at climate change in some of its documents, sort of. And then two, I think, this will kind of plant the seed for other, pushing the state policymakers, agencies to start really, the public is demanding this. We acknowledge and we, that the state has, a job to do here, but we also know that we're in a climate crisis, and the public is demanding the state to protect us under the Constitution. And so I think, there are different places where we're kind of trying to push, and one is the Montana Public Service Commission, which doesn't look at climate in its necessarily in its regulation of public electric and gas utilities. And so and they're also exempt from the Montana Environmental Policy Act. And so we've gone to the Public Service Commission to ask them to adopt a rule to require them to account for the social cost of climate change in their regulation of utilities. So things like that, I think, from my role as like kind of in an adversarial role where I sue people, but also from just the public really pushing now that our hope is that there was a lot of inspiration that has come from this case and these brave young people, where it just plants a seed and starts a web of advocacy and just in individual decisions to really to help people push the needle forward, because it takes all of us. So I'm gonna leave it at there, and I would love to have a conversation.
Wow, thank you.